Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk about a very important recent case involving two people who I believe really have narcissistic features or are NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. And this is the case involving Ruby Franke and JODI Hildebrandt. Okay, both Ruby and JODI, I think, are very close to NPD, or at least they're narcissistic in the way they behave. Okay, and in fact, I think both of them probably have a little bit of antisocial features as well, just in their kind of their glaring disregard for the rights and dignity of other people, and especially children. Okay, so basically, just to sort of give some background here. All right, so JODI Hildebrandt, she holds herself out as a mental health professional, and she does have credentials. Okay, whether she's active with her licensing, I'm not really sure, but she holds herself out as a mental health professional. And basically, her sort of signature is that she sort of ties in her Mormon beliefs and her Mormon ideology, sort of ties that into her vision of mental health. And so, because she sort of tailored her mental health sort of practice to her Mormon beliefs, and she's done it sort of holding herself out as a very upstanding Mormon. I think a lot of Mormon, like Mormon bishops and like Mormon officials, have sort of put her on a short list as being like a recommended therapist in the Utah Mormon community. So she's become a very sort of a high profile, sort of a Mormon mental health professional, sort of Mormon slash mental health professional in Utah. And Utah obviously is like the home of Mormonism. So this is like a pretty big deal. Now, let's see. Ruby Franke is just a private citizen. I don't know what her education is, but she holds herself out sort of like Lori Vallow. She sort of Ruby Franke sort of holds herself out as like an ideal Mormon parent, basically. And so she holds herself out as being also she holds herself out as being good looking. Okay, that's sort of similar to Lori Vallow. So she sort of holds herself out sort of like as a model, sort of a model parent. It's sort of a combination of a model and a parent. And sort of her mission through her social media influencing, basically her mission is basically to show to the world what she thinks is ideal parenting. Okay, so that's kind of interesting because to a lot of people, even including people who have cluster B disorders, I've been diagnosed with cluster B disorders. Okay, just even me looking at her, it's very obvious to me that as she tries to model like the ideal parenting to the world, she's actually showing, I think, a pretty shocking level of disregard for the dignity and the rights of her children. Okay, and actually engaging in abuse. But she's doing it with this complete confidence and this like religious justification. Okay, and so what we see in both Ruby Franke and in JODI Hildebrandt, in both of these cases, we see this religious justification and this sort of religious aspect of basically narcissistic and even I would even say psychopathic behavior. Okay, so what can we call this? Religious psychopathy or religious narcissism? Well, I think it's probably fair to think that it's not just the religion. I mean, there are lots of people who practice Mormonism and they're not committing crimes, and they're not being necessarily narcissistic about it. So I think we have to look at it as it's not the religion necessarily that's causing all this abuse, although the religion I think has some toxic aspects, I'll be honest. But it's not just the religion, it is how the religion is deployed in the hands of people who already have narcissistic and psychopathic features. Okay, so how can we learn from these two people? In other words, like I don't want to make this video just putting people down. Okay, I take the position that yeah, it's a problem what both Ruby and JODI are doing. Okay, it is a problem, and they may deserve to be punished. I mean, they have to be held accountable. But I don't really it's not really my philosophy to sort of look down on people. And in fact, I don't even really look down on Lori Vallow, honestly. I mean, they're accountable. But I try to look at how they do operate with some level of disability, in the sense that while we are accountable and responsible for our mental condition, okay, having a cluster B condition, having narcissism, even having psychopathy is a condition. Okay, your brain is different. Your neurology is different. Your mental state is different. Okay, you don't have the same sobriety. You don't have the same you don't have the same wherewithal as a normal person. Okay. So they have there's something impaired in these people. Okay. And I want to try and explain, how I see their narcissism, and not as a way of putting them down, but as a way of respecting how serious this case is, how they've hurt people. Okay. And what all of us who have cluster B or cluster B adjacent issues, what we can all learn from this. Okay. Because obviously the goal at some point is to have less of these incidents, and any of us who have cluster B issues, to try to minimize the abuse that we perpetrate in the world, and also the minimize the waste and the destruction that we perpetrate in the world. Because in the end, it's okay to have an addiction. It's okay to have a cluster B disorder, but it's what we do with it. We are accountable. Okay. And we have to learn from these cases, because, in the very best case, if you are addictive, if you have an addiction, if you have a cluster B disorder, you can get better. Okay. It may take a lot of work. It may be the hardest thing you've ever done, but we have to learn, and we have to gain whatever insight we can from other examples. Okay. And including our own lives as well. But, from this case, from the case of both JODI Hildebrandt and FRANKE, Ruby FRANKE, what we can learn from them to give us more insight and to sort of help with understanding, so that these kind of disasters where you end up abusing and torturing children, where that can be minimized in the world. Okay. And I think that has to be the goal. So basically, I think all of us understand the basic DSM criteria for narcissism. Okay. I think most of us understand that if you just boil down the DSM criteria, basically narcissism is just a combination of sort of having a lot of envy. Envy is sort of a big thing, combined with sort of, for some reason, this envy sort of goes along with, for whatever reason, sort of looking at yourself as being more special than other people, sort of looking at yourself as being like more important than other people, and sort of regarding other people as sort of lesser and less important, and also having sort of less of a sense of the reality and the fullness of other people. So that when you operate with other people, you sort of operate in a sort of exploitative manner. Okay. And you just don't really treat people as like full humans. You sort of treat them as vehicles for whatever your interest is. Okay. And I think we can clearly see that Ruby FRANKE treated her children almost like objects, and that when JODI Hildebrandt would talk about parenting, she had this extremely dictatorial sort of way of sort of presenting parenthood, where the children are just like these lowly subjects. And in a way that is kind of the same as, what happens in the traditional narcissism, where basically you just treat other people almost like objects. Like they say exploitative, but it just basically means you treat other people like they're just like instruments, basically. Okay. Where you just express a persistent sort of minimization and disregard for the reality of other people. And that's not far unrelated from, let's say, the features of psychopathy, where you just have a persistent sort of disregard for the rights and the dignity of other people. Okay. And you actually violate those rights. Okay. So what we see here is, we don't just see a combination of two people that are just acting like snobs. And they're not just acting like arrogant, like typical NPD. They're actually going to the point of actually torturing and, abusing people. So that is, I think, crossing the line and getting into the at least features of psychopathy. Okay. Whether they have, I don't think they have full-blown psychopathy, but, at least features. So I think probably the best way to describe both Ruby and JODI is that I would say it's malignant narcissism, basically. Maybe not all the way to psychopathy, but not just being arrogant and looking down on people. They're actually crossing the line and actually abusing people. So I would say that's malignant pathological narcissism, basically. All right. So anyway, so we understand basically the DSM criteria, but for me to make more sense of what's actually happening with both JODI and Ruby, okay, I try to look at like what is underlying the DSM symptoms. I always try to look at like what's going on. Like I know the car is pulling to the left, but what's wrong with the suspension and with the tires that's actually causing the car to move to the left? Okay, so basically the way I look at narcissism is just a theory, but it's just, a theory that I hope that we could just at least consider. But the theory that I have with narcissism is that basically it has to do with a fundamental temperament of irritability. Okay. Irritability around things that are frustrating and things that are, let's say, unfair, frustrating, dissonant, contradictory, sort of a low tolerance for contradictions, for dissonances, for aggravations, frustrations, whatever, just a very low tolerance, and sort of almost like you're stuck in not liking things, but you sort of put up a wall so that you don't process those things. Okay. So in other words, let's start with the classic example in narcissism before we actually look at JODI and Ruby. Okay. One of the classic aspects of narcissism is how envy sort of eats at a narcissistic person. Okay. Envy. All right. Now I'm assuming that all people, when you see somebody that's better looking than you, when you see somebody that has more money than you have, when you see somebody who has a better personality, who, whatever, who just has, some advantage that you don't have. Okay. Obviously, I think all of us are going to notice that. And I think all of us are going to feel it on some level. Okay. But for whatever reason with the narcissist, it just gets stuck where it's like a hang up where it feels really uncomfortable, but there's no processing and integrating that into the larger reality. It's like you get stuck at that discomfort. Okay. So basically that's a classic example of being confronted with something that's unfair, something that's contradictory, something that's dissonant, something that somebody has what I don't have, I have what someone else doesn't have. Or let's say I have a sickness. Let's say I have a sickness and someone else is healthy, how you sort of feel the injustice, whatever. But for whatever reason with narcissism, sort of like there's no acceptance. Okay. In other words, like if you look at like the stages of grief, when something bad happens in life, there's a part where you sort of want to resist it. And then over time, you sort of process it and accept it. Okay. For whatever reason with narcissism, when confronted with certain dissonances, conflicts, certain contradictions, certain incompatibilities, things that seem unfair, things that seem unjust, there's sort of like you sort of get stuck in that process where you're in the first stages of confronting something uncomfortable where you feel uncomfortable, you're rejecting it, that you're intolerant, but it doesn't pass over into the level of acceptance. Okay, so it's sort of like getting stuck in your throat. You don't swallow it and then metabolize it. It just gets stuck in your throat and you just cough it out, basically. So it's kind of like people that have cluster B temperament, they're so irritable and they're so intolerant of things that are just contradictory, incompatible, things that are dissonant, that they sort of get stuck in your throat and you end up spitting them out instead of swallowing and digesting. Okay, so basically people who have cluster B, because of their irritable, sort of intolerant temperament, they don't end up digesting things that normal people can digest and integrate in their lives. Okay, so they keep spitting things out that need to get digested, and because they don't digest, they don't reach a level of integration. So they're stuck at a level of, I would say, fragmentation, where they're not really integrated. Okay, and so basically, how do I see this in both Ruby and in JODI? Okay, now the first thing is, like, I understand they come from a Mormon religion. I understand they're raised in a strict religion. Okay, so they already come from a background where they expect like very strict compliance and a very high demand discipline. Okay, I understand that. But even then, okay, if you're a normal person, okay, you can tolerate a certain amount of inconsistency. Okay, you can tolerate a certain amount of incoherence, a certain amount of contradiction. Okay, so in other words, I hold a belief. Okay, but I'm dealing with my children, and my children are not demonstrating, let's say, strict compliance with what I believe. Okay. A normal person has the flexibility to sort of hold that, swallow it, digest it, metabolize it, and at the same time still believe their theologies and still believe their ideologies. Okay. They can have both, even though they're incompatible, because they've learned to sort of swallow those things. But see, someone who has cluster B, they just cannot tolerate inconsistencies. They cannot tolerate, and they just spit it out and they never digest it. So they have not integrated into their lives what it means to hold inconsistencies in their being, in their presence. Okay. So let's say if you have a child who, isn't, let's say, scrupulously to the standard of what your religion says is honesty, or like say sexual, whatever, let's say sexual righteousness or whatever. Let's say you have a child and maybe you have a doubt that maybe they're masturbating or whatever. I mean, I'm not here to say that it's not a problem. I mean, I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that masturbation is that great to be doing all the time. Okay. But at the same time, the fact is it's a human being, it's your son, and that even though it is an issue, okay, even a lot of Mormon parents who firmly believe that masturbation is a sin, if they know that their son is masturbating or they suspect it, it's not going to be such a crisis for them because they're not suffering that cluster B thing where they can't swallow and digest a certain amount of inconsistency. In other words, they hold a belief, but the reality with their children maybe is not up to the standard of that belief, and yet they can sort of hold the inconsistency and it's not going to be like a major crisis. It's an issue to work on. It's probably something to be dealt with, but it's just going to be dealt with over time, organically, and in a sort of a moderated way. Okay. But when you look at a person like Ruby Franke, okay, let's say the daughter, she's supposed to make her lunch in the morning. That's the family rule. Basically, according to the laws of the family and the way that's sort of integrated with their Mormon beliefs, the children have to be rigorously compliant with all the family rules. So that if the child forgets to make their lunch in the morning, well, then they're not going to eat all day and they're going to starve all day. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to harm the child. I mean, I guess a child can go maybe 20 hours without eating and they're not going to be like in the hospital, but on the other hand, a young child, they have a very fast metabolism and children can get hypoglycemic. And I would say that it's probably extremely irresponsible to sort of withhold meals from children as a form of punishment. Okay, I would say that's very irresponsible. And I would say that even if you didn't have medical knowledge of why that's irresponsible, I would say that just at a gut level, I think most of us understand that to be a very extreme form of punishment and almost kind of a cruelty, But because Ruby, she doesn't have any tolerance for that little bit of contradiction between what the rules of the house are and then the actual performance of the children, which the children are never going to perform 100%. And so when she sees any like minor infraction, any minor departure from her standard, the 100% perfection standard, she spits it out. She can't swallow it and digest it. It's like she has like a total intolerance of that. Okay. And so basically, that to me is a very narcissistic, that's a sign of someone who is very narcissistic. Okay. Because basically, okay, let's look at the NPD symptoms in the DSM. Okay. Basically, what about the arrogance? What about looking down on people? Okay. If you really think about it, having an arrogant attitude and looking down on people, what that really is, it's an inability to take in realities other than your own personal reality. In other words, I have my own reality. I have my own belief about how important I am. Okay. But then it is also true that if I thought about it, I could think about how important other people are and the realities of other people. Okay. But if you think about it at a fundamental level, the realities of other people are sort of at a contradiction and at odds with how important I feel. Okay. So if I'm kind of screening out how important other people are, okay, basically what's happening is I'm expressing sort of an intolerance for the incompatibility of different perspectives. Okay. So the perspective of what's important for me, how important I am, and then the perspectives of how important is another person, what's their life all about, how real is their life, etc. Those are different perspectives. Okay. And in a sense, they're incompatible because they come from different places. All right. So in other words, to hold, like say, if your brain is like a processing unit, okay, to hold how important I am, and then also at the same time to consider the importance of other people, those are sort of incompatible, sort of divergent, sort of dissonant realities, okay? And if you're that kind of person where at a very early age, you have no tolerance for dissonance, no tolerance for contradictions, for alternatives, for multiple perspectives, okay? Basically, you're going to have sort of like a pervasive, sort of a chronic, you're not gonna blend in different realities and sort of blend them into like a single, metabolized, integrated sense of the world. Okay. So basically, a person who has narcissism, basically just the standard NPD symptoms, basically, is showing the signs of a person who hasn't processed the multifaceted realities of not just dealing with your own personal life, but the lives of people in your environment and the very environment that you live in, the things that are outside of you. Okay. And so if you don't have even that basic ability, to sort of process dissonant, conflicting, alternative sort of ways of thinking, okay, then of course, when you're, let's say, disciplining your children, you're going to have a real hard time processing the fact that your children can't rise up to, like, say, a certain standard, because that would be another conflict, you see. So basically, I think what's more fundamental in narcissism than, let's say, the arrogance or the looking down on people, I think the more fundamental issue is that real delicate temperament where you just have a very low tolerance for conflicting, sort of contradictory, alternative, different, you know what I mean? Like sort of the frustration that how you think the world should be, or how, let's say, one way of looking at the world, how another actual reality doesn't jive. There's like, they don't come together. There's difference. You know what I mean? So basically, this to me is a classic thing of NPD and cluster B, that you just don't have, you haven't developed the ability to process the sort of the multi-realities of a real human life. Okay. So basically the children, they're not rising up, like, say, to a certain level, a standard. And basically it's almost like a psychological block where the mother cannot process the fact that the actual behavior of the children is somehow not at the same level as, like, another way of thinking, like her primary way of thinking, her I guess the belief that she has about how to run a family. So basically that to me is a sign of a very narcissistic personality. Okay. And then, so let's look at the same thing with JODI Hildebrandt. Okay. So basically JODI Hildebrandt has this very black and white idea that there's the truth and there's distortion, basically. Okay. And the truth is basically sort of like her way of understanding, let's say, her Mormon theology. Okay. And basically, distortion is basically anything that's sort of sinful, that's sort of not fully real, that's not fully honest, whatever. Basically, not living in the light. Okay, so she has this kind of idealized sense of being righteous and being sort of in the darkness, or being sort of disturbed and sinful, whatever. Okay, that's fine. But the thing is that if she had any realism in her life, if she wasn't so cluster B, she would realize that we're all human beings, okay? And so because we're human beings, we all aspire, even I would aspire to be as truthful and as, in a way, I would aspire to be as healthy as possible, right? But I'm a human being, okay? I'm not always going to reach the aspiration. In other words, it's nice to have an aspiration of like a perfection in honesty and a perfection in authenticity, whatever, like having zero sin or whatever. But in reality, as human beings, we don't reach ideal levels of performance, and we don't reach ideal levels of authenticity, or even honesty, or even truth. Okay. So like even in my recovery, the idea of my recovery is I want to be, let's say, more open to the full reality of the world, not just my own personal enclosed reality. I want to be more open to the reality of other people, to the environment. And I want to allow more dissonances to come in, to myself, so I try to have like a more open, like a less naive, a less solipsistic sense of living, But the fact is because I have a temperament, okay, it's not easy for me, all right? And sometimes I falter, and sometimes it doesn't, I don't meet my own standards, okay? And I think, to me, you have to be at a very immature level of narcissism to be so impaired in your thinking that you actually can even begin to believe that you as let's say JODI Hildebrandt, that even she could match her own high standards. Okay. In fact, I know she doesn't meet her own high standards, but she sort of seems to sort of hold out for everybody that there's either like this perfect compliance with these standards of being, let's say, truthful as opposed to being, distorted. She sort of has this idea that she herself meets this extremely high standard, and her tolerance level for people who don't meet this really high standard is extremely limited. Okay, and that to me shows the typical cluster B sort of that lack of tolerance, that in the real world things don't always match up. They're not all harmonious. There's a lot of disharmony. There's a lot of dissonance from whatever we might think of as an ideal. Okay. And so basically, I see in both of them a tremendous level of intolerance. Okay. And, sorry. Anyway, my brain, this case is like an overdose for me. Because I mean, it makes me think. Actually, this case makes me think really hard about cluster B. But anyway, one thing I noticed with JODI Hildebrandt was something about, she gave an example of like, well, I have a jacuzzi. It's my jacuzzi, or it's my swimming pool, and in my property, I decide whether people put on bikinis or whether people don't wear bikinis, because it's not a public pool. If it was a public pool, I couldn't say. But if you're going to come to my house, you're either going to wear like the bathing suit that I want you to wear, or I will invite you to leave. Or she says, you're invited to wear the bathing suit that I want you to wear, or you can leave, basically. And I think that in a way, that's a classic example of how she's not meeting the standard that she espouses, okay? Because she espouses the standard of this perfect honesty, okay? But she is not owning up to the fact, and she's not able to see that what she's really doing is she's being passive aggressive, and she's pretending to be so friendly by saying, I invite you, when the actual content of her communication is, you're going to do exactly what I want, okay? So she's camouflaging this very demanding, very dictatorial posture with this simulation of you're invited and this simulation of friendliness, when the actual thrust of her posture towards people is, you're going to do what I tell you to do. Okay. And so that is actually dishonest, because she's camouflaging a very sort of unbecoming posture with this sort of this kind of flowery, very friendly veneer, but actually on the inside, it's not very friendly. Okay. So in that sense, when she says you're invited to whatever, she's actually camouflaging something that's actually not very friendly. Okay. And in that sense, because there's that camouflage, I would say that she is not being really honest and transparent of her own motives and posture. Okay. And that's probably because she probably can't tolerate the fact that she has parts of her that are very aggressive and very dominant. And she probably can't tolerate the fact that that doesn't necessarily match with, let's say, the loving ideals of her her form of Christianity, which is Mormon Christianity. So probably because she's not able to hold those things together, she sort of has a fragmented self where she sort of believes that she's being very friendly, but she's not aware of the aggression. Okay. And I think this is very common in cluster B, that we sort of end up fragmenting sort of like the uglier parts of ourselves, because we hold these, like, say, high ideals for ourselves, and we can't really tolerate the inconsistency that we might actually have things that are not up to that standard, okay, or that are not even consistent with that standard. So what happens is then you start forming like satellite parts of you that are not inside your personhood. They're sort of like orbiting. And I would say that probably in both the case of Ruby and in JODI's case, I think they think of themselves as very nice people. I think they think of themselves as very gentle, very loving people, okay? And I think basically because of their religious identification, and probably very similar to Lori Vallow, they've sort of put out as a satellite, and they have not integrated. And so they're not really in touch with the fact that they have parts of themselves that are actually very aggressive, parts of themselves that are very aggressive and actually, very vicious. And so basically, just to try to summarize all this, basically, I just think that, when you have a cluster B disorder, basically the basic issue to me is a temperamental intolerance of inconsistency and conflict, okay, and things that are not things that are dissonant, okay. And so because you cannot process things that are sort of like disparate and conflicting, then you end up with sort of like dissociated satellite aspects that can be very dangerous. So anyway, that's my best interpretation, and thanks for watching.